Hi, my name is Robert and I'm one of the insiders with InsideJapan Tours, and here I am happy to bring you to my city of Osaka for the last 7 years, and I'm really keen to show you what makes this place a really unique place, an exciting city in the heart of Japan. Now, before we start the tour, Osaka is in what's called a state of emergency today at the time of recording. And what that really means is it's not really a lockdown, so people aren't actually forced to stay at home. As you can see around me, there's plenty of people out and about today in Osaka, but there are some regulations put in place to try and decrease the spread of COVID, and so I do have my mask with me as well, so I'll be using it throughout the tour. But if there are places where it's safe, for example here, there's no one around me at the moment where I can take off my mask and talk about something to you, then I will do so, come in front of the camera and point something out. I just wanted to explain to you as well where Osaka is located. This is the map of Japan. At the very top we've got Hokkaido, Kyushu, and then marked in red here is the prefecture of Osaka, and within that prefecture is the city of Osaka where we are today. And so it's quite important geographically, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the tour, but I just wanted to point that out before we start. So now I'm just going to put on my mask, and then what I'd like to do is now take you on a stroll of Osaka. So where we are at the moment is a place in the very central part of the city called Amerika Town, or in Japanese, Amemura. And the idea behind Amemura, well actually, after the Second World War, this place was a very derelict part of the city. There were very much empty parking spaces, warehouses, some factories. It wasn't a very pleasant part of the city at all. And early in the early 70s or late 60s, around that time, this hip cafe opened up in the area, and that started to attract a much younger crowd, or rather artists as well, to the area. And over time it developed into this sort of a very hip, arty, fashion central of Osaka. And as you can see by looking at some of the shops as we walk down this street, there are quite a lot of what appears to be vintage clothing, or even sort of American style clothing. And that's essentially where the name Amemura comes from. The idea is that over the decades, as this place developed into this sort of very youngster, hip location, lots of imported goods came into this part of Osaka, mostly clothing from the US, but also imported vinyls, for example, and very sort of like unique items that might be hard to get in the rest of the city. And so over time it has developed into this sort of artistic, fashion, vintage clothing, those kind of crowds coming to this part of the city. Now, where we started is a place called Kakukoin, meaning Triangle Park. And over there, it's the hotspot of Amemura. And what I mean by that is it's home to outdoor fashion shows, outdoor concerts, live events, also a makeshift skate park, although if you were to go there today, you'll notice signs as well saying, please don't use your skateboards here. But I was talking about artists, and as I mentioned, live music happens over there. But also this place here called Bronze Live House is one of the most famous independent music venues in Osaka. And it's where a lot of independent bands come here to play, and it's really like a revered place. If you're an independent musician, you came to play here, you're doing pretty well for yourself. Now, Osaka is known as the kitchen capital of Japan, and so I'll talk more about what kind of cuisine is unique to Osaka, but certainly Osaka likes to experiment with its food. So whilst this I wouldn't quite call traditional Osaka food, for example, banana dogs, where you've essentially replaced the sausage with a banana and put whipped cream and chocolate sauce on it, it still gives you a sense of the love of food that local residents here in Osaka have, and the amount of experimentation people like to do with food here as well. But as I mentioned, there are sort of more unique or traditional Osaka foods, and when we come across those, I'll speak more about those later on. Just here on the right-hand side is a Capsule Hotel. The reason I want to point this out today on the tour is because the first ever Capsule Hotel opened up in Osaka around about 50 to 60 years ago. So Osaka actually invented the Capsule Hotel. And just over here, I just want to show you a little bit. We can't go inside to film, but I can certainly show you a bit about what you would expect from a Capsule Hotel. So here you can see in this image, typically on any floor of a Capsule Hotel, you will have at least 2, maybe sometimes 3 levels of these capsules lined up across the floor. And then the idea is everything you need for your accommodation is located in this capsule. And the premise of a Capsule Hotel is to provide efficient and convenient accommodation, mostly targeted towards business travelers, but nowadays more so for tourists who want to experience this. And inside this capsule, as I mentioned, everything you need for the night is there. You've got your bedding, you've got your TV, a radio, air conditioning as well inside. And then there is some level of privacy in the sense that whilst you may not have a door, you do have a blind that you can shut, and that is the only barrier between yourself and then the communal area outside of the capsule. Now, whilst it has everything you need, what it doesn't have are toilets and bathrooms. And so for those who need to go to the toilet or need to have a shower, most of the capsule hotels will have shared bathing areas and shared toilets as well. So this is an example of what you might expect in terms of the bathing area. This is called a sento. It's not quite the same as an onsen. Onsen is natural hot spring water, but this is heated water, typically through gas. But it's shared experience, very much like an onsen. And then you also have a sauna sometimes, if you would like to go to one. But then also communal areas exist as well. So here there are some massage chairs lined up, which I would love to be sitting on a massage chair right now. But then also a manga library. Now, for those who aren't familiar with manga, a manga is like a Japanese comic book, and we say comic book, it makes it sound like a very young thing to do, but actually a lot of adults also love reading manga in Japan, and so these cater to quite a wide range of visitors staying here. Now, something I suppose that's quite prevalent in Osaka that might be unusual in the rest of the country are the presence of litter and graffiti, or just maybe sort of generally not very clean image of the city. And people do think Japan is a very clean place to be in, and that's very true. But Osaka does have this very casual, laid-back atmosphere amongst its residents. And it does show, I suppose, in also the amount of graffiti or litter that might be prevalent across the city. And so if we do come across some of it, I'll try and point that out as well as a very unique part of Osaka culture. As we're continuing on our stroll through Osaka, I mentioned a little bit earlier about how important food has become as part of the culture in Osaka. And one example is called a takoyaki, which literally means cooked octopus or cuts of octopus cooked in really hot batter. And I'll show you a little bit more of that just shortly, but just before we continue, I just want to point out this building as well on the left. You can see that it has this huge dragon at the top, very sort of brash or sort of outlandish decoration in front, even graffiti on the window, which quite clear has been purposely done. So again, reflects the sort of artistic side of this area of Osaka. And the reason I wanted to point that out because a lot of other cities in Japan, say for example Kyoto, a very historical city, there are very strong regulations in place to try and keep that historical element of the city, which sometimes can seem a little bit conservative. But here in Osaka, again, going back to the idea of that very laid-back atmosphere, again, also shows in terms of how expressive some of these buildings or decorations are as well. A lot of the times those buildings also express what they're selling or serving. That one perhaps not so easy to spot in terms of having a dragon in front, but this one is very clear that they sell what I was just talking about, takoyaki, because of the octopus at the very front or at the very top of the building. And over here you can see in the menu what a takoyaki would look like. Takoyaki, again, as I mentioned, is cuts of octopus cooked in hot batter. Basically, it turns into a ball of batter with octopus inside. And then on top, you would have this very sweet brown sauce topped with mayonnaise. And then on top of that, any kind of topping that you might want to include. So a typical topping for a takoyaki would be a powdered seaweed and also shredded bonito flakes on top. Now, I run quite a lot of the street food tours in Osaka, and when we order these takoyaki to try, a lot of people sometimes are a little bit panicky in seeing those bonito flakes actually moving in the air. And so some people even ask me, is this alive? No, is the answer. But the fact is the takoyaki is so incredibly hot that what happens is the flakes move in the air, they dance to the heat. Now, as we're coming up to this street here, this street that we're about to cross is called Midosuji. And it literally is an artery, or one of the arteries through Osaka. And it's actually even in the name, because the suffix suji means artery. And Midosuji itself, I like to think of it as kind of like a Champs-Élysées of Osaka, because as you can see in front of us right now, there is the building of the Louis Vuitton. So there are many high-end shops that line this street, and this particular Louis Vuitton also expresses some of the very unique Japanese architectural choices. So for example, this one, it's made to look like Japanese washi paper covering the building on all sides. And then over in the far corner, you might be able to just make out a building with a green circle and a Japanese kanji, a dai, written on it, and that is the dai maru. Maru in Japanese means circle, and dai maru is one of the department stores, a very famous department store around Japan, but also located here in Osaka. And down the street, if we were to just pan down south as well, that's Namba district in front of us now. And there is another famous department store called Takashimaya. And whilst those department stores are very much like, say for example, Bloomingdale's or Macy's in the US, or for the UK, something close to, say for example, Harrods or Selfridges. They do cater to lots of high-end shopping. But as I mentioned, Osaka is the kitchen of Japan, but also you can have a gourmet experience just by going to the basement of these department stores too. They are actually called Deppa Chika. Deppa being short for department, and Chika means underground. So under the department store is a huge maze of all sorts of amazing food options for you to try. Just by visiting one of those places, you can really fill up on all sorts of amazing food. Now, Osaka people love sweets, sweet. Typically, Osaka is very famous for its savory options, but for example, there are lots of fantastic eateries that showcase sort of an Osaka take on sort of, for example, croissants here, or egg tarts, for example. But here it's topped off with lots of different toppings like chocolate or almonds. And for example, here, strawberry mania. There are lots of different cakes or sort of like buns with whipped cream and strawberries, and also at the very top, the Daifuku. Daifuku is like a rice cake that's flavored, slightly sweet, and then with a strawberry sort of stuck in the middle. And so for those who love sweets and have a very strong sweet tooth, I highly recommend coming to Osaka because not only does it have amazing sort of savory options, amazing Japanese sweet options too. Now we're just entering a shopping arcade. In Japanese we call this a Shotengai. I just want to quickly give you an idea of how extensive this shopping arcade or Shotengai is. As you can see, it just goes on for miles and miles and miles up here, and then also even down south as well, just miles of shopping, of the shopping arcade. Now, this one may appear very long, and actually, you know, it is one of the longer ones, but it's only a mere 2.1 kilometers. There's actually an even longer one north of here at 2.9 kilometers as well. And that one claims to be the longest shopping arcade, the longest Shotengai in Japan. Although many places in other parts of Japan also claim this title as well. But certainly if you think about it, 3 kilometers is a very long street. And the idea of the Shotengai came about, well, people believe it came about as early as the 16th century. And it's basically a road that was built up by merchants to sell lots of items, and they were typically built up around religious sites or roads leading up to religious sites, because the idea is that a lot of people did congregate at religious sites like Shinto shrines or Buddhist temples, so it made sense for merchants to also set up shop either around those areas or leading up to those areas. And for those who like to support local businesses as well, I do highly recommend visiting a Shotengai like this one, because you do have named brands like the sort of the chemist that we just saw on the left-hand side, or sort of you know, these like shoe stores like Atmos and all those kind of bigger brand names. But Shotengais are also typically home to local businesses as well, and so it provides a really good blend or a mix of local businesses and big brand names, ideal for shopping. And this is a store that specializes in K-pop merchandise or Korean pop music merchandise. And so there is quite a strong link, especially amongst the younger generation of Japan and in Osaka in particular, in that a lot of young people here love Korean pop culture, love Korean music, and likewise a lot of young people in Korea do love Japanese pop culture as well. And actually Osaka is home to the biggest Korean population in the country. There is actually a large Korean town called Tsuruhashi in another part of the city. And you know, whilst we hear historically the relations between Japan and Korea have been difficult, certainly the younger generation do like the culture in both ways, and so that's really a positive step forward. I was just talking briefly about where those Shotengais are located historically, but actually nowadays when modern Shotengais are built, they're now typically around sort of large popular landmarks or large transportation hubs. So for example, here we are heading in the direction of Namba, which is a huge transport and shopping hub of Osaka, and so it makes sense to have a maze of Shotengais in this area as well. Now, as we walk closer to the end of this part of the Shotengai, we're slowly entering an area called Dotonbori. And Dotonbori as an area dates earliest back to the early 1600s, when a local merchant by the name of Yasui Doton, which is where the name Dotonbori comes from, actually wanted to expand the waterways to this area to increase the commercial prospects of this part of the city. And clearly it's worked, because if you look around you, it is very much a commercial hub of Osaka as well. And earlier I was talking about Midosuji being a Champs-Élysées of Osaka, but I do like to think of Dotonbori as the Times Square of Osaka, because if you look around you, there are these huge signboards everywhere and these sort of neon lights and big sort of like digital billboards everywhere. And this is a very iconic part of the downtown Osaka, one of the sort of the strong images of Osaka that crops up. Now, we're just waiting for the traffic light to change green, but perhaps in the distance you might be able to notice that there is a large running man with the sign Glico on the top. And Glico is a confectionery company that started in Osaka. And the idea behind the confectionery of what Glico produced was to allow children to study hard, but also play hard and eat well. And what I mean by eat well is that Glico, what they did, the first sort of caramel candy that they produced was a sort of a caramel candy that was infused with glycogen. It was very easily sourced in Osaka because of the proximity to the Seto Inland Sea, where there's lots of abundance of seafood there. And they extracted glycogen and put it into these candies to make them incredibly nutritious. And the idea behind the Running Man is also to promote the idea of healthiness. And so it is believed that if you were to eat one of these caramel candies, it will take up to 300 meters of distance for an individual to run to burn off the calories produced by those candies. And so actually this Running Man is also affectionately nicknamed the 300 meters man as well. Now at the moment it's covered up because the 7th generation of the signboard is due to open up at the end of June. Now as we pan over to the other side of the bridge, you may notice quite a large yellow structure poking out of the side of the canal. And that is actually a very famous Ferris wheel. And again, you know, Osaka is very famous for all of its strong imagery, and this Ferris wheel is again another one of those strong images of Osaka, and it belongs to a shop called Don Quixote. For those who perhaps have been on a tour with me before knows my affection of Don Quixote, because Don Quixote is essentially home to anything and everything you could possibly imagine at a reasonable price, including a wide variety of Kit Kat flavors. So if you want to come to Japan and you want to buy, you know, a very unique flavor Kit Kat, whether it be a wasabi flavored Kit Kat or a roasted green tea, not just green tea but roasted, certainly visit Don Quixote. Now historically this was a merchant area, but also Dotonbori was basically akin to something like Broadway in New York or the West End in London, because it was actually a very prominent theatre district in Osaka. Now you probably won't find so many of those theatres anymore, but the building in front of us is actually one of the remaining theatres that still line this part of the city. Now traditionally those theatres were host to traditional Japanese performing arts, for example kabuki plays, no theatre, bunraku, and this one in particular still is host to kabuki productions, but now also is host to a lot of more modern productions. For example, you can see that the theatre at the moment has these blue posters at the very front, and these posters are of a production by a drama school called Takarazuka, located in also the area called Takarazuka. That's where the name comes from. And what's very unique about the Takarazuka Drama School is that only female students are allowed to enter this drama school. And when they enter, they are decided at that point whether they, for the duration of their study, play either female parts or male parts in any of the productions that they do. And so they train. So if they are destined to play male parts, they are trained to perform in such a way to be able to reflect male roles, and vice versa, female roles as well. And again, one of the big characteristics of Takarazuka is the fact that they are always putting on production with extravagant costumes, sets. It is like a feast for your eyes if you were to go and visit one of these productions. I just wanted to direct your attention to this map as well of Dotonbori. This is the road that we're about to walk down now, but as you can see, the characters represent the names of the theatres that once used to be in Dotonbori, and as you can see, it was essentially just lined with theatres. And these pictures will give you a good example of what those theatres used to look like along this street. And because of the fact that Osaka had this sort of flourishing arts culture in the city as well, you can see from this picture, for example, how incredibly busy, how incredibly popular the theatre scene became in Osaka. I mentioned earlier that, you know, Osaka is very relaxed in how they like to decorate their stores, for example, or how they're quite expressive, not just in decorations of stores, but just in general as well. And so here is another example of a shop, or rather a restaurant, with a huge octopus at the very front. And so it's very easy to know straight away what they sell, because they sell takoyaki. Takoyaki, the octopus cooked in this piping hot round batter. Now, just up ahead, you might notice there's quite a large statue of a fist with the number 2025 blazoned across it. And this is because Osaka has won the bid again to host an international expo in 2025. So we're very excited about that because it will bring lots of visitors to the city again. It's going to be a huge event. So if you're interested in visiting in 2025, Osaka is definitely the place to be in that year. And again, just as we pass the statue and the lamppost, you'll notice that there is actually another store with a moving crab. I don't know if you can see it actually moving incredibly slowly. There it goes, off to the right. But this is an incredibly famous crab restaurant in this region, in the Kansai region. And this is the original store in Osaka here. But there are other stores by that company dotted around, for example, in the city of Kyoto as well. But if you were to come here to try out the street food of Osaka, I highly recommend going there because they serve fresh grilled crab for you to just eat straight away. Very, very highly recommend it. And again, over here on the left-hand side, as we pass this quite a large sign that we just saw a little bit earlier, we are Osaka. It says in Japanese, "Gambare Minami, Gambare Osaka," which means you can do it, Osaka. And it's essentially like a motivational speech for local residents to beat COVID, which is a really nice sort of atmosphere when you sort of see that. Now this store here, you might be wondering, what on earth are they selling? Because before it was very clear. One of the restaurants sold octopus or octopus balls, and then also the other one with crab. This one is actually fried pork dumplings. Now, fried pork dumplings, they're called gyoza in Japanese. They are very popular, you know, around Japan, but certainly if you visit Osaka, you have to try the Osaka version of those pork dumplings. And just over here, you might see what looks to be quite a bizarre looking mascot. And now, again, it's one of those very strong images of Osaka. And this one is called Kui Daore. Taore means to fall down or to collapse. And the idea behind this mascot is there's a phrase that says, "Eat till you drop," which is, sort of taken quite affectionately amongst the local residents. And there is this sense of banter or sort of friendly rivalry between Osaka and Tokyo, and a lot of people in Tokyo might use that phrase in a joking manner and say, well, actually, people in Osaka devour their food to the point where they collapse. But actually, local people in Osaka likes to use that to their sort of advantage and say, actually, we love our food because our food is so good that yes, we do keep eating because it's so amazing, perhaps even better than the food available in Tokyo, that they do fall from or collapse from the sheer amount of food that they eat. Now, as we continue our stroll, I mentioned a little bit earlier about the performing arts, or the traditional performing arts of Japan that was so prevalent here, one of which is bunraku. And bunraku dates back as early as the 1600s, and it's a form of puppetry theatre that requires extremely intricate movements that require sometimes at least 3 or 4 performers to be able to pull off those intricate movements. And it's complemented through a very strong vocal narrative style of recitation of a particular story, and a very delicate, plucked shamisen instrument in the background. Now, earlier in the tour, I did say that we would try to point out some of the graffiti or the litter around Osaka. And this is a really good example of, whilst we say, okay, there is graffiti, there is litter in Osaka, there is still some element of politeness behind that, because you might have noticed that nobody's really tagged over somebody else's tag when they're putting graffiti on a wall. So whilst there might be causing damage to a building, they're still respecting other artists or other graffitiists by making sure that they don't go over somebody else's. So there's still an element of Japanese politeness there. Now, on top of this building, you might notice a very unusual sort of figure, which looks to me like a very weird, bloated baby. And this is actually called a bilikan. And it's become a very popular mascot, or even a good luck charm / god in Osaka, because it's meant to be the god of what ought to be. And it's, again, reflects the idea of that sort of very laid back, what ought to be attitude of Osaka people. But actually it doesn't really have its origins in Osaka. It actually has its origins back to the early 1900s, where an art teacher in Missouri came up with this figure or illustration of bilikan. And it's actually since become the mascot of a university in St. Louis. Also, several baseball teams have taken it on as a mascot. But again, because of that message of what ought to be resonates with people in Osaka, it's also become a good luck charm here, which is why you see it on top of restaurants, for example, and people will rub its feet for good luck as well. Now, here is another example of a typical Osaka cuisine, and this is called kushikatsu. And what you can see on the top is the food item, and at the bottom, that same food item covered in batter and deep fried. And the idea of a kushikatsu is you can order whatever you want, whatever it might be. It could be vegetables or seafood or meat. They'll put it on a wooden skewer, deep fry it, and then serve it to you on a plate. And then, I just wanted to point out this thing here, just over here. This is basically a tin of a brown sauce, a very light brown sauce that's put on every single table. And the idea is you'll take your deep fried whatever it is that you ordered, and you'll dip it into the sauce and you eat it. Now, there is a very careful unwritten rule in Osaka that is you don't double dip in the sauce. And the reason behind that is that tin of sauce will remain on the table for several rounds of customers or guests seated there. And so you don't want to double dip because you'll be putting your germs into that tin for the next person. They do replenish the sauce, but not that regularly. So if you do come, make sure you don't double dip. And then here you can see the sort of sheer portions of some of the food that's been served here. Now, certainly most restaurants won't be serving these humongous portions of the takoyaki in front of you, for example, but it still gives you an idea of the love of food that people here have. The fact that there are restaurants that would still serve those portions in Osaka. Now, as we come round here, in front of us is Hozenji Yokocho, or the entrance to Hozenji Yokocho. Now, Hozenji is the name of a temple nearby that we'll be going to very shortly, and Yokocho is a phrase or a term in Japanese given to streets just like this one, or alleyways just like this one, that caters towards bars and restaurants. So we had the Shotengai for the merchants, but now we have the Yokocho for the eateries and the bars and the restaurants that exist here as well. And then this particular Yokocho exists dating back to the Edo period as well. So again, the sort of late 17th century to the early 19th century. And as we walk along here, we may notice at the very top of one of these entrances to one of the establishments is a round brown ball that's been sheltered for some reason. And this is called a sugidama, and typically it's a ball made out of cedar. And essentially what it is, it's not just decorative, it's a clock. And normally it will be hung in front of a sake brewery, and when they hang it, it'll be green, and then over a period of 1 month it will turn brown. And obviously, depending on the type of sake that you produce, roughly speaking, it will take about a month to complete the process of making sake, and it will take about a month for this to turn brown as well. And so when people walking by see that it's turned brown, they know that the sake that they're producing is ready to be consumed or to be purchased. And so that is the idea behind it. Now, lots of places nowadays that aren't sake breweries, but places that serve alcohol will also have the sugidama in front because it's a symbol that it serves alcohol. I'm just going to take my mask off here and just come in front of the camera, because I just want to point something out to you over here as well. Now, you might notice this symbol if you were to come to Japan quite a lot on things like maps, for example. And a lot of people do ask me when they come, they ask me, Robert, why are there so many swastikas in Japan? I didn't realize the Nazi regime was so prevalent here. But actually, this is not a swastika. In fact, it's quite the opposite of a swastika. Whilst maybe a swastika represented all things that are quite negative, actually this is the complete opposite, that it represents all things sort of positive and some peace, for example. And you'll find it in lots of Buddhist temples, because actually it's one of the key symbols of Buddhism. As if you were to look at a Japanese map, for example, you may notice these symbols dotted around. And the name of this in Japanese certainly is not a swastika, it's called manji in Japanese, manji. So if you look at a map, lots and lots of manjis are placed around that indicate where Buddhist temples are located. Now, the meaning is the complete opposite, but also the way it's presented is the complete opposite as well. Because if you look at a swastika, you'll notice that actually it's almost like a diamond shape in the way it's being presented, but this is actually kind of like a square shape. And then where these sort of points, the bits that point out on a manji, these are actually pointed in a clockwise manner. But if you look at a swastika, it's actually anti-clockwise. So even, not only just the meaning, but even the presentation of the symbol is the complete opposite of a swastika. Now we are just coming into Hozenji, the temple, the Buddhist temple that I was talking about. And this Buddhist temple was built in 1637. And there's a very unique way of praying that you might be able to see just in front of us. So there's a man, a gentleman, splashing water on the deity in front. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that is a practice here at Hozenji. Hozenji enshrines the deity of the Fudo Myo, which is one of the warrior kings in Buddhism. And if you look very closely at a Fudo Myo, you'll notice, and it's quite hard to see in this one because this one's covered in moss, but if you saw one that's not covered, you'll notice that actually there is a very frightening appearance. A face full of wrath is what some people like to describe it as. And then in the right hand there is a sword, and the idea behind the sword is to cut through deluded and ignorant minds. And then the rope on the left hand, which is symbolizing the idea of binding up the wicked or keeping people from astray. And then the fudomyo itself is typically presented either seated or standing on a rock, and then engulfed in flames behind as well. And perhaps you can just about make out the sword in the right hand, for example, in this particular image of the fudomyo. Now, the reason why this particular one is covered in moss goes back to a particular legend that doesn't date back very far, actually, perhaps only about 100 years ago. And then there was a story that a young woman who came here to pray accidentally splashed some water in doing so on the deity, and spontaneously moss sprang out of nowhere on the statue. And because this was seen as kind of a miracle or a sign of good luck, people have continued to do that as a tradition since. And so we saw earlier a gentleman here splashing water on the fudomyo before praying. It's become part of that tradition here at Hozenji. Now, if we just come across back over here, you'll notice that there is a kind of a basin in the middle where the water is kept. There is a ladle that's currently inside the basin. And then just over here on the floor, on the ground, there are buckets full of water. And the idea is that if the basin runs out of water, then you can fill it up with the buckets of water and continue the process. But you might be asking, well, where does the water for the buckets come from? And for me, this is the perfect example of the coexistence of religions in Japan, because just across here is a Shinto shrine. Now, Buddhism is an imported religion into Japan, but Shintoism is the indigenous religion of Japan. And the idea is, if you run out of water, you'll bring a bucket over to the well that's located in the Shinto shrine, fill it up with water, and then bring it back over to the Buddhist temple, fill up the basin, and then continue the process of praying to the fudomyo by splashing the water. Hozenji was actually also a location for lots of performing arts performances as well. And so whilst we had the theatres nearby in Dotonbori, there are actually outdoor live performances here too. Now, as we continue our walk, for those who perhaps joined the virtual tours of Kyoto or Nara, you may have noticed that actually those cities are incredibly historic in the way that it looks. You know, as you sort of walk through, there are these amazing historical temples and old buildings and so forth, and that's been largely kept. Whereas in Osaka, perhaps not so much. There are lots of these sort of brand newer buildings propping up everywhere. The vibe is very different here. And despite that sort of modern aspect of Osaka, Osaka actually plays a vital role in understanding some of the earliest periods of Japan's history, as this area is considered to be one of the first ever places where the first inhabitants of Japan actually settled. And I showed you at the very beginning of the tour the location of Osaka in Japan, and that location perhaps is largely one of the reasons why the earliest inhabitants decided to settle here, because you have the close proximity to the Seto Inland Sea, so you have the abundance of seafood for people to live off. But also, it might be a little bit hard to see from today, but Osaka is surrounded by mountains very close by, which gives you access to lots of fresh water, and the climate here is also ideal for growing vegetation. Now, if you were to visit Osaka and even go down to the southern part of Osaka, you can also find places where there's evidence of those early settlers. For example, you can see evidence of skeletons that were buried alongside seashells in a mound called Kaizuka. And those Kaizuka mounds date back to the Jomon period of Japanese history, which is actually between 14,000 BC and 300 BC. And then following on from there is the Yayoi period from the 300 BC to 250 AD. And that period, you can find evidence of that period where people have started to show the sort of evidence of more permanent, more complex styles of living. For example, permanent buildings that have been erected for accommodation, or tools for rice farming and cultivating vegetables, for example. We were just walking through here, just panning over here back to the right, if that's okay. And if you go to Tokyo, I mean, there are these game centers dotted around all over big cities in Japan. And if you were to go to Tokyo, one of the most prominent areas would be Akihabara, if you wanted to visit game centers. But Osaka, again, going back to the idea of that sort of very laid-back, enjoy your life kind of atmosphere, these game centers are all over the place. And this one itself is a huge one. Even just the ground floor, or the first floor, if you're watching from America, is just only one type of game, which are the UFO captures. Basically, you pay some money into the game, and then you manipulate a crane to try and pick a toy or an item or a snack out of those machines. Now, as we cross over, you might notice there's quite a large, what appears to be like a bridge over the street, and that is actually a highway in Japan, or even in Osaka. Most of the highways in Japan are raised above ground, like this one, and they're great. You know, if you're willing to pay the toll to get on one of those, it can send you from one side of the city to the next in no time, because you avoid all of the traffic that's under the highways that goes through the heart of the city. And so a lot of people who aren't used to, say, for example, motorways or highways high up ground, perhaps a little bit surprised to see this network of motorways or highways above ground in Japan. Now, Japan is a very mountainous city, and what that means is that space is a premium. There isn't much space available, even in cities like Osaka. And so when you are walking through Osaka, it's fine to sort of look in front of you to see what's available. It's also important to look up as well. And so this is one example of a building where there are so many different establishments located on every floor. So for example, on the second floor is a family restaurant, we call them in Japan. This one specializes in Hamburg steaks called Bikkuri Donkey, which in English means surprised donkey. I don't think there are very many surprised donkeys in that shop, but there you go. And then also located in the same floor is Saizeria, which is a chain Italian-style restaurant. There is a yakiniku place, so if you wanted to eat cuts of meat, that's where you would go. Karaoke, sushi places, ramen, and so forth. So, I mean, even in just one building, there is a huge variety of different establishments. So it's certainly worth not just looking in front of you, but also looking up. Now, the first time I came to Osaka, I was pleasantly surprised, I suppose, I was very young at the time, at how many what appeared to be like clubs that are dotted around in Osaka. For example, this one here on the right-hand side, or even on the left here, just especially on this particular Shotengai, so many of these establishments. Now, whilst they may look like clubs from the front, they're actually pachinko parlors. And now, you may have heard about pachinko before. In Japan, gambling is still technically considered to be illegal, except for some exceptions. For example, you are allowed to bet on horses, for example. But by and large, gambling is illegal. There are conversations about legalizing gambling, and of course, being Osaka, the idea is that Osaka, if gambling is to be legalized, will be the first city in the country to host a casino. But you might be able to see through the glass doors and windows there, if you were to enter a pachinko parlor, you'll be greeted by just lines and lines of these what appear to be pinball machines. And also, if the doors open, it will be incredibly loud. So perhaps best not to walk inside. But the idea behind it is that you would go in and you would purchase either a box or a crate of very small pinballs, and you would put these pinballs into the machine, and they will just go all over the place. And then depending on where those pinballs go, you would either lose them or gain more back. And because you've purchased those pinballs and you've won those pinballs, they're yours to keep, and you can do what you like with them. And so what a lot of people will do is then exchange them for prizes on the site. Now bearing in mind, this isn't gambling, because you're not exchanging it for money, just exchanging it for prizes. And these prizes could be very trivial. For example, a snack or a soft drink perhaps. And then what you would do with your prize, if you decide to exchange your pinballs for the prize, is then to take it around the corner to what is literally a hole in the wall, and then you will then sell your prize for cash. So you would give over your prize, and then out will a hand with cash for you. And because what you've done is you've taken those pinballs, your winnings, or what you've purchased, off the premises, you've gone round the corner and sold them, it's actually not gambling, because you're not directly exchanging those pinballs for cash. So a very smart way of perhaps finding a loophole in the gambling laws of Japan. So earlier I had introduced you to takoyaki, the octopus cooked in balls of batter, and the kushikatsu, whatever you like, deep fried and then dipped in a sauce. But another thing I would like to introduce you to is okonomiyaki. And this particular stall on the right, for example, is quite famous for okonomiyaki. And we can't really go up close and personal to film, but I can certainly show you here in the picture what it looks like. And the idea is that it's cooked on what's called a teppan, which is translates to hot plate. So you might have heard of the word teppanyaki. That's exactly what it is. It's the hot plate called the teppan. And for me, okonomiyaki really captures what Osaka is in a food, because it is essentially like a savory pizza pancake hybrid. And the word okonomi means whatever you like. So kind of similar to the kushikatsu, where you can cook whatever you like. But essentially it's a batter-based, egg-based batter with shredded cabbage, and then the filling is up to you. Whatever you want to put in that filling, you can put in. And so some of the typical fillings would be, for example, mixed seafood, beef, pork, really up to you. And that's why it's called okonomi, whatever you like, yaki, to cook. And because it's that essence of whatever you want, you know, life's too short, do whatever you like with your life, live your life. To me, this okonomiyaki really captures the essence of Osaka. And different regions are very famous for their take on ramen. Ramen here is egg-based noodles cooked in typically a meat-based broth, most commonly pork, and then topped with vegetables. But certainly if you were to come to Osaka, be sure to try the ramen here as well. Get the Osaka take of ramen. Now, earlier I was talking a little bit about the traditional performing arts of Japan and how they were very popular in Osaka. But also, Osaka is home to comedy. There is a very famous company called Yoshimoto that specializes in stand-up comedy and also, even more so, double acts. And this is one of the theatres that specializes in Yoshimoto productions. And I just want to bring you a little bit closer here to some of the posters that they have available. And as you can see here, it's prominently mostly double acts that are quite famous in Yoshimoto style comedy. But there are some single stand-up comedians as well, but double acts are the go-to for Osaka comedy or Yoshimoto comedy. But also over here, the Yoshimoto also does kind of sketch shows on stage as well. And these are typically characterized by really sort of absurd sort of makeup or costumes. In particular, a lot of these comedians will stick with their sort of well-known style of makeup or costumes, and then this sort of comic book style set in the background as well, to add to that sort of comedy feel of those productions. So I suppose if you understand a little bit of Japanese and you wanted to catch some comedy, be sure to come to one of these Yoshimoto theatres in Osaka. That's where you get the highest standard of comedy and the largest amount of laughter as you enjoy those shows. Now what we are walking towards is another Shotengai called Dotonbori. And this particular Shotengai used to be part of the pilgrimage route of connecting Hozenji, where we were just at, the small Buddhist temple with the Fudo Myo, and Shitennoji Temple in southern part of the city, which is the oldest Buddhist temple dating back to the 5th century in Osaka. And for merchants in Osaka, it made sense to, as I mentioned earlier, build shotengais or shops, or even just lining these pilgrimage routes with shops as well. And Dotonbori here is now known as the kitchenware street, because as you can see here, for example, that shop specializes in plastic food. For example, you just saw that fish in the box. That's definitely not a real fish, it's a plastic fish. And you might think of Japan as synonymous with these kind of plastic foods, and you're probably quite right in the sense that they're built for restaurants to display in incredibly high detail the dishes that they serve. And so there you can probably buy some as a souvenir. But a lot of these shops here, including that one, cater to the restaurants that are located around this area. So for example here, uniforms for staff at those restaurants. And then further down you'll find, for example, the stationery items that you might require to run a restaurant. Here some lanterns or some signboards or curtains that sort of reflect what your store is selling. This is where you would come because it's also incredibly reasonably priced. But for those who are watching who are perhaps very keen cooks, or maybe you're a chef yourself, certainly do come down to Dotonbori here in Osaka, because again, there are so many items, even specialized items, but also just your standard items, cooking items, very well reasonably priced. I think you would have a ball here walking down looking at some of the items that are on sale. Now this area, as I mentioned, was once a pilgrimage route, but was destroyed a couple of times by either fire or most recently in the Second World War under sort of the air raids that occurred in Osaka. And as a result of the most recent, destroying of this area, this actually became an area of one of the black markets in Osaka. But in the early 50s, the city decided to clean up the area here and sort of bring back this sort of kitchenware street idea back to Dotonbori. So what you see here today is a reflection of that city trying to clean up the act of this particular location. Now earlier I was talking quite a lot, or rather I mentioned quite a number of times about merchants and how important they are to Osaka. So I just want to dive in a little bit more about merchant history in Osaka. Osaka as a merchant town became a very popular merchant town during the Edo period, which was the early 17th century to the late 19th century, because of its central location in the country, as I showed you earlier in the map. But a part of that was also, because of its location, it became an incredibly important port city. And so a lot of goods from southern part of Japan would come into Osaka first, and then they were shipped to very prominent areas around the country. For example, at the time, Kyoto was the capital city, and Osaka is very close to that, and so it provided a fantastic link of providing lots of goods to Kyoto, but also links to Ede, which is currently Tokyo, but at the time a political powerhouse of Japan. But also rice, which is synonymous with Japan in Japanese cuisine, being a very important staple of Japanese food, was also, the majority of rice was brought into Osaka first before being shipped out to the rest of the country. And so it became a very important idea of Osaka feeding the rest of the nation. And perhaps that's also where the idea of Osaka being the kitchen capital or the cuisine capital also comes from. Now, at the time, there are 4 classes of society in Japan. You had the merchants, the samurais, the farmers, and the craftsmen. Samurai being at the very top of the hierarchy, and then merchants at the very bottom. But also, the merchants had, unlike the samurai, I suppose in a very capitalist way, the biggest ability to earn as much as possible, because of the fact that really they would just make money from whatever they could sell. But the samurais had a very strict stipend. And also the merchants had more flexibility in expressing themselves through fashion by deciding what accessories they want to decorate themselves with. Whereas samurai didn't. They had a much more regulated, conservative approach to how they can dress. And basically the point being is that being merchants, a city full of merchants, really also gave rise to the idea of that sort of very flexible, very expressive style and culture of Osaka city. Right, I'm just going to take my mask off and just pop in front of the camera here, and this concludes our sort of virtual tour, the stroll of Osaka city, and hopefully I was able to share a little bit about what makes this place unique compared to the rest of the country. And also, I don't know if you've been keeping up with the news, but now Osaka is the second most livable city in the whole world. And so I'm very happy to be living here because we were beaten by Auckland perhaps, but anyway, we have one of the most livable places in the world. And so certainly if you were to visit Japan, please do come to Osaka, and then I'd be more than happy to show you around and dig even deeper into what makes this place a wonderful place to visit in Japan. So I'd like to say thank you very much for joining me today, and please have a fantastic day, evening, week, wherever you might be, and I hope to see you soon live face-to-face here in Japan. Thank you.